Hello learners, welcome to this session on the topic short story, which is included in module 4 of our course on creative writing. So everyone loves a story. A story sometimes takes you to a world other than the one you are living in, and you are left fascinated by it. A short story is perhaps easier to read and less time consuming than a novel, which takes a long time to finish reading. But a short story also is perhaps harder to write than a novel, as it has to create its effect in a limited number of words. Like miniature paintings, they are tightly wound and every detail counts. In this video, we shall discuss short story as a literary form and look at the different characteristics which a good short story needs to have. You may have noticed that stories differ in their atmosphere. For example, you have love stories, ghost stories, detective stories, etc. So each of which creates the mood that is characteristic to it. We may have noticed that the characters in a short story do not develop in the course of the narrative because there is little scope for it. We shall discuss all these aspects in detail as we move forward in this video. Before we go on to discuss the characteristics and the techniques of writing a short story, first of all, it is important to get an idea, to get an overview of the literary form of short story. So as we move on to understand the short story as a form, let us first understand what we mean by fiction. Fiction is basically a narrative of some events or events. So a narrative, as we all know, it tells a story by presenting the events in a logical manner. From a prehistoric oral tradition to a very postmodern present, fiction has traversed a long way. The short story is just such a form of narrative fiction. Like the novel, the short story evolved from various sources of narrative from all over the world. Hence, it is difficult to determine where exactly it originated. Let us briefly look at some of the definitions of short story as forwarded by renowned writers. From these definitions, it is clear that a short story has to make an impression upon the mind of the reader within a short period of time, say an hour or two. The aim of all good literature, as you might know, it is to delight its readers and expand its understanding of man and manners. The short story is not different in this aspect. Today, it is a very popular form and its popularity owes itself to various causes. In this age of rush and restlessness, a lot of factors draw a reader to the sweet pleasure of reading a short story. The short story is very difficult to classify as it is one of the most elusive forms, and it is also very difficult to define it within a particular limit. In this context, let us see what Somerset Maugham commented in his preface to his complete short stories. Quote, "If you ask how long should a short story be, it will be impossible to construct it within a set limit. There are long short stories and very short stories. The shortest item runs to about 1600 words and the longest to about 20,000 words. In fact, most short stories fall somewhere between these two extremes. Although the short story as a literary form existed in the remote past in some crude form, its popularity and prominence is of recent origin. You have probably heard of the parables of Jesus Christ. These parables were narrated by Christ to his disciples to teach them moral lessons. The simple and candid way in which these stories are told stirs the heart of the listeners as well as the readers. So the fable, which is a short narrative in prose, or it may be in verse, and which points to a moral, is also in a sense a short story. You must have heard about Aesop's fables like the lion and the mouse, the hare and the tortoise, the old man and the bundle of sticks, etc. These are all specimens of early short stories. Classical Indian literature too has a plethora of fables which can be deemed short stories too. The characters are mostly animals through which certain moral values are personified. For example, we have the tiger and the fox, or the elephant and the fox, the old tiger and the traveler, and so on and so forth. So we have the Buddhist Jataka tales, the Panchatantra, and the Bodhisattva tales. The famous Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer are also short stories, even though they are written in verse. But it is only in the modern times that the short story has been able to garner huge significance and recognition. Some short stories which have become part of the common lore are the detective stories of Arthur Conan Doyle, the mystery with a touch of the Gothic stories of Edgar Allan Poe, the moving stories of human relationships of O. Henry, the pleasant stories of Guy de Maupassant, and the veritable treasure of our very own Rabindranath Tagore's short stories. Now, let us move forward to understand and analyze the distinctive characteristics or qualities that a short story possesses. The major features of this form, number one, is brevity. So Edgar Allan Poe has described the short story as a prose narrative, quote, requiring from half an hour to 1 to 2 hours for its perusal, unquote. Again, we see William Henry Hudson, who says that a short story is something which can be easily read at a single sitting. Whereas the novel is an extended piece of narrative fiction, the short story is limited in length and scope. Therefore, we can assert that yes, brevity is the first and significant feature of short story. Next characteristic of a short story is it covers a short period of time. That is, a short story is basically a narrative which deals with certain incidents and which involves certain characters around which the story revolves. It should create a single impression and effect upon the reader's mind. Generally, a short story deals with incidents covering a short period of time. However, consider stories like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle or The Bat by Anton Chekhov. Here, the narrative covers a long period of time. Of course, the concentration of interest and the singleness of impression must be maintained in order to classify the short story as a really good one. Another crucial feature of a short story is the quality of storytelling. In keeping with the oral storytelling tradition, a short story tells a story. So, storytelling forms an important aspect of a short story. A short story should have a plot which is constituted of events and actions and which achieves certain realistic, artistic and emotional effects. And if the plot is stirring, then the story without doubt will be beautiful. A good plot is also commonly said to have unity of action. Fourthly, character portrayal is an important feature of a short story. A short story cannot have a huge cast of characters, as in case of a novel, and also the characters' traits cannot be delineated in a detailed manner. As a result, the short story begins close to or at the height of the action and develops only one character at length. Also, there are some epiphanic moments which the character experiences. That is, a moment of illumination in which something hidden or not understood becomes suddenly very clear. Characters like Rahmat in Rabindranath Tagore's Kabuliwala, Old Bearman in O. Henry's The Last Leaf, or the giant in Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant are beautifully portrayed characters that are truly remarkable and unforgettable. Thus, the plot, characters, and the atmosphere must work in tandem for a short story to be effective. The short story also must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is, it should have a proper structural design. The world's best known short stories adhere to this dictum and delight us with their descriptions of man and manners. Now let us move to the next segment, that is fundamental elements of a short story. Like any other genres, short stories also have certain fundamental elements which include plot, character, setting and point of view. So let us discuss these elements in detail. So number 1, plot. So what is the first thing we look for in a short story? Obviously, we look for the plot. That is, the way in which the events in the story relate to one another and how they relate to the story as a whole. We also look for conflicts which may occur in the story, and we are eager to know the way in which these conflicts are developed and resolved. Sometimes we may notice that the story is told in flashback. Sometimes it may look forward to events in a possible future culmination. Let us try to understand what Clint Brooks and Robert Van Weren stated about the plot. I quote, "The beginning of an action always presents us with a situation in which there is some element of instability, some conflict. In the middle of an action, there is a period of readjustment of forces in the process of seeking a new kind of stability. In the end of an action, some point of stability is reached. The forces that have been brought into play have been resolved." Unquote. This is from Understanding Fiction. So plots are necessary for a story to achieve a desired effect, whether it is tragic, comic, satiric, melodramatic, etc. So it is shaped by the way in which the events of the story are connected causally, by the way in which the characters interact with each other, and also by the juxtaposition of the events. The plot again has various stages. The plot moves from an exposition through a series of developments to a climax, and then finally it leads to a denouement. The exposition sets the tone for the story by introducing a character or setting a scene, or perhaps even through a hint of the events to be expected. Let us look at this extract from Ismat Chughtai's story Housewife. It begins thus, quote, "The day Mirza's new maid ambled into his house, there was a sensation in the neighborhood," unquote. So, after reading this line, we are left expecting what will happen next. So, as the plot progresses, the events build up to a climax, which is the point of greatest tension in the story. The scene which proves to be a decisive element. The denouement or resolution. It draws the actions to a close and ties up all the loose ends. In some stories, however, there is no resolution provided and is left open-ended. This leads the readers to decide how the conflicts could have ended. Sometimes the resolution is achieved with the help of Deus ex machina, that is, God from a machine, in which a hard-pressed author thinks up implausible, impossible or extraneous events to resolve a plot. Generally, the events in a story are presented in a logical and chronological manner. But modern short stories often subvert the order of events. The story may begin in the middle or even at the end and then move back to the beginning to reconstruct the incidents. William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily is a good example. As already mentioned, stories may be told in flashback, which may provide vital information to the readers, which will help one to understand the story better. Some stories also involve foreshadowing, that is, introduction of events, situations, or characters early on in the story, which hint at things that are about to come. This encourages and entices readers to get more involved in the story. So experimental stories always arouse interest in the readers as they try to decipher or interpret the meaning in their own ways. So while you are watching this video, think of a plot, say some event of your own life, and make it the subject of a story. So now, character is another element that constitutes a short story. Characterization. It is the way in which the writers develop the characters and reveal their traits to the readers. Characters can be developed either by telling the readers about them, as in case of stories with third-person narrators or first-person narrators can tell their readers about themselves or other characters. For example, Mr. Watson in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories reveals aspects about himself. The fact that he is a doctor with a good practice, and also about the idiosyncrasies and brilliant powers of detection of his famous friend Sherlock Holmes. E.M. Forster, in his book titled Aspects of the Novel, classified characters as being flat and round. So a flat character is one which does not develop much during the course of the story, what you can call a stereotypical character. Sherlock Holmes is a flat character, as he is already developed and does not need to bring about much variation in his personality. On the other hand, a round character is a well-developed one, who is closely involved in and responsive to the action of the story, or the plot, we can say. So the young banker in Anton Chekhov's The Bet is a rounded character, for the fact that there is a growth of the mind and outlook of the character. Let us look at the following tips for creating characters. So we should try to make it clear as to who is the protagonist or the antagonist and who are the other major and minor characters. Next important point is that will the story be any different if some of the characters were not there? Is the physical appearances of the characters of any importance at all? The personalities of the characters also need to be delineated in a lucid manner. Or what will the readers infer from the background and prior experiences of the characters? That means readers should be able to identify whether the characters are flat or round, or the characters develop through the narrator's comments or through their own actions and dialogues. It will be interesting to note whether the readers are sympathetic with the characters or not, or whether the characters behave in a way that is consistent with how readers expect them to act. So next important element that we must consider while writing a short story is setting. Setting is important because it helps the writer in creating the texture of his imagined world with its character, locale, and environment. It establishes the story's historical, geographical, and physical location. In some stories, the setting is almost a character, perhaps influencing the characters' behavior, as in the stories of Ruskin Bond, where his place of residence, Missouri, is a pervasive presence. A particular historical setting can create the appropriate mood for the readers to appreciate the story. If we know that a particular story is set during, say, the French Revolution or Industrial Revolution or any other, we can understand the characters' behavior, their mannerisms and dress code, and so on. Let us see what Anne Scott Momaday has to say about the importance of setting in a story in the book Ancestral Voices. I quote, "I think that the sense of place is extremely important to most writers. Certainly it is to me. I identify very strongly with places where I have lived, where I have been, where I have invested some part of my being. The earth was here before I was. When I came, I simply identified place by living in it or looking at it. One does not create place in the same way that the storyteller creates himself, creates his listener. The writer creates a place." So, stories may be set in cities or villages, in advanced countries or in underdeveloped countries. This makes the readers understand why the characters behave in a way which are unfamiliar to us. Sometimes, even regional differences within a country may account for differences in plot development and characters' motivation. Also, the size of a city or town is sometimes important. If the town has a small population, the characters' behavior will be subject to intense scrutiny, like in Ruskin Bond's stories, whereas in large city, the characters can lose themselves in the crowd. The time of the day. It can also influence a story's mood and development. In detective stories, the aim of a murder, for instance, can help unravel the mystery of the murder and the murderer. In Catherine Mansfield's Her First Ball, a ballroom serves as the setting for a young girl's initiation into the rules and realities of adult society. Weather can be also an indicative of a situation in the plot. A storm, for example, may indicate danger descending upon the character's life. A sunny day may indicate a prelude to a happy event, etc. The various physical attributes of the setting combine to create a story's atmosphere. A story's atmosphere also influences a character's state of mind, leading them to react in different ways in different settings. Here are some pointers to be kept in mind while writing about the setting. So whether we have specified the setting or only sketched in the details, or is the setting simply a background to the story, or is it a pivotal character? Are the characters influenced by the setting and has an effect on their behavior? It will be good if you look, or if you can specify how the setting influences the story's plot and lead the characters to act and react. So are the readers able to appreciate the time period in which the story is set, particularly the historical setting? So how are the location and time important to the development of the story? The general atmosphere of the story also must give the readers an inkling of the events to happen. So it is important to note how significant is the change in the atmosphere as the story progresses. Now, let us come to the fourth fundamental element of short story. That is point of view. Point of view signifies the way a story is told. Stories are mostly told either in the first person or the third person. The second person narration is a rarely used mode. It should keep in mind, however, that even when the writer uses the first person, I, the narrator of the story, may be completely different from the writer, as the writer creates narrators to tell their story. However, there is a certain limitation in first person narration, as the narrators cannot relate the story of their own death, or they cannot enter into the minds of the other characters. They may also sometimes distort facts either by mistake or by being confused. Hence, they become unreliable. Let us now look at third-person narration, which is by far the most common form of narration in stories. In this kind of narration, the narrator is someone who is outside the story and refers to the characters either by name or by he, she, or they. The Rocking Horse Winner by D.H. Lawrence begins, quote, "There was a woman who was beautiful, who started with all the advantages, yet she had no luck. She married for love, and the love turned to dust. She had bony children, yet she felt they had been thrust upon her, and she could not love them." This is an example of third-person narrator. So third-person narrators are omniscient in the sense that they can move at will from one character's mind to the other. They are a privileged lot as they can have access to the character's thoughts, motives, and states of consciousness. Third-person narrators can present a more inclusive overview of the happenings in the story than the first-person narrators can. Sometimes the third-person narrators are intrusive, who, along with reporting the events, also comments on them, and sometimes offers personal views on human life. Others are unintrusive, that is, they tell the story from an entirely objective point of view, without commenting on the events and also allowing the readers to interpret them without any interference. So instances of objective narrators can be found in Ernest Hemingway's short stories like A Clean, Well-Lighted Place and The Killers. The second person narration is that in which the story is told as an address by the narrator to someone he calls as you. This is not a very common form of narration. The second person may either be a fictional character or the reader or even the narrator himself. The story unfolds by shifting between telling the narratee what he or she is doing at present, what he or she has done in the past or may do in the future. Although one point of view is dominant, writers sometimes introduce other points of view to achieve a level of complexity. We have looked at the origin and development of short story, its characteristics and the fundamental elements as well in the earlier sections of this video. Now, let us look at a glance some famous short story writers who have made this form a popular one. Edgar Allan Poe's contribution to the genre is worth mentioning. He especially excelled in the detective story genre, which had elements of the Gothic. Some of his famous stories include The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, The Gold Bug, The Mask of the Red Death, and so on. O. Henry is a master of the surprise ending, and his stories are characterized by a twist in the tale, as can be seen in the stories like The Gift of the Magi and The Romance of a Busy Broker. Alexander Pushkin was among the most prolific of the Russian realistic short story writers. Gogol is another Russian short story writer whose stories about everyday occurrences of life and common people move the readers. The Overcoat is one of Gogol's seminal stories. Leo Tolstoy, besides being a novelist, is also noted for his short stories. His story, What Men Live By, is a thoughtful piece of writing. Anton Chekhov had a profound influence on the short story. Guy de Maupassant is the most outstanding of French short story writers. Alphonse Daudet and Gustave Flaubert are other notable French short story writers. Among the English short story writers, mention may be made of Thomas Hardy and his Wessex Tales, Arthur Conan Doyle and his The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, H.G. Wells and his science fiction stories. D.H. Lawrence wrote some great stories dealing with human relationships. Saki also wrote witty, ironic and elegant stories of enduring interest. The Spanish-American authors Luis Borges and Gabriel Garcia Marquez use a lot of magic realism in their writing to captivate their readers. The magic realism is crucial in providing the readers with an alternative perception of reality. So there are Indian short story writers too who have proved themselves as successful practitioners in the genre. Among them are Rabindranath Tagore, R.K. Narayan, Prem Chand, Ismat Chugtai, Ruskin Bond, Shashi Deshpande, Amrita Pritam, Khushwant Singh, etc. among others. So we have therefore seen that the short story has evolved as a specific form of literary art, like any other form of art, having its own characteristics and its own laws. The genre has been instrumental in providing its readers pleasure and wisdom, and all that a good art must offer. So that's all in this video. I hope you have got an idea of the various intricacies involved in writing a short story. Thank you.